Now, you might have noticed that the world did not end in 2012. But does that mean that the Mayan religion was wrong? And is that why we know that their gods do not exist? Well, no. First, most people already did not believe in the Mayan gods even before that date. Because why would they? And then there is the detail that the Maya never predicted such end of the world date. It was just some popular hype that we had. Who knows where we got that. But the Maya calendar does indeed end in that date. But we also make calendars that end every year, and no one thinks that just because that piece of paper ends in December 31, the world's going to end. Likewise, the Maya simply carved half a millennium ahead, and that was more than enough work. We make a calendar for 1 year, they carved half a millennium ahead. That's kind of weird, but that's how it goes. Another question, however, is why that date? Why precisely on the 21 of December of 2012? And to understand that and where all of this came from, we need to see how the Maya counted time. They counted time by observing the stars and notice the repeated pattern that they make in the sky. Like there is this constellation here, there is that constellation there. They are traversing the sky a little bit every day, every night. And so they notice the seasons of the year and all such cycles to the point where they could build their temples aligned to those stars in the due season. And to keep track of that, they made a calendar, like we do. And so they had a smaller calendar for some shorter time scales, but what we are interested here is the long calendar, that one that they have carved 500 years before their own time, and the one that ended on 2012, 21 December of 2012. So, the calendar starts with a day. That's pretty easy to find. It's a very easy pattern to notice, and every other civilization has used it a day. That's a very easy one to find. The second one, though, was kind of weird. You would usually expect some lunar cycle, like a week, 7 days, but it was 20. 20 days is a cycle for some reason in Maya. Why? They like 20. The only answer I could find. Now, if you have 20 of 20 days, you can see that it's 400 days. That's too much for a year. And by the observation of the cycles, they could see that was too much. They could not put 20 of 20, and so they multiplied it by 18. 18 times 20 is 360. It's almost a year. And that's the Mayan year. It's the approximation. They thought that was the cycle. And then they went back to 20. There will be cycles of 20 years now, and cycles of 20 times that. 400-ish years. And that cycle is the one that they have carved on that calendar that ended in 2012. Because it was almost half a millennium ahead of them. That's 400 years. So they did not choose some random date. They just took the calendar and carved it to the end, the next cycle. And that's about it for the calendar. But what does that calendar tell us about my religion, or how right or wrong they were? Well, to count time, you have to start somewhere. You have to decide on some date. And when did the Maya start? That question, of course, on the date of the creation of humankind. That's a good place to start, and that is where the Mayan calendar starts to count. 21 of December of 2012 marked the 13th completion of that 400-year cycles. So it was the 13th time that this cycle had come from the creations when the gods were supposed to have created humankind. And if you count that 400-ish 13 times, you will get that it was a little more than 5,000 years ago that the human creation age of the Mayan calendar had begun. And through a modern calendar, that's 3,100 years before our common age. And this, because of that, and not because of 2012, that we can know that the Maya were wrong. Why? Well, let's take a look at Egypt. When we study Egypt, we find several artifacts, and they tell us about Egyptian history. We have some for 3,000 years ago, 4,000, and we have artifacts of 5,000 years ago. And on those artifacts, it is tell us about Narmer. The pharaoh Narmer was changing history, actually about 5,100 years ago. And that history he was changing was not some new history. It was a very old one. Egypt was divided into two, and he, around that date, was having his double crown put on and unifying all of Egypt under his rule. We can also mention China and other civilizations that were already formed at that time, and which already had some history going back, far back at that time. But then comes a question. Why would we believe those Egyptian texts and those Chinese texts instead of believing that sacred Maya one? Well, Egyptian and Chinese and those several civilizations, there's a lot against one, but still, we just have to choose. Are we going to believe the Egyptians? Or are we going to believe the Maya? And this is a really hard question, and which I say there is no right answer, because the question itself is so wrongly framed. We do not choose to believe one on another. We do not pick that one which we like best. We investigate to determine which ones are true and which ones are not. And so, some guy posted on the internet today, which is quite common, some new creation myth, some new religion, we will have no reason to believe in him. And if he made some forgery of some pottery, like that Egyptian pottery, that was recounting some old civilization, saying that it was from the time of the dinosaurs, we will have no reason to believe in it. Because without relying on those texts, on what those artifacts are actually saying, we can dig them. And if we find something deeper, well, that something is probably older. And if we compare that with the style of the things around it, if it matches that, we know that it is from that time. And we can make that progression map of the succession of styles. The styles of Egypt 4,000 years ago are very different from those of 5,000, for example. Just like the art we find today is very different from just a few decades ago. And on those large amount of times, we see that style changing. And so we can take things based on that. If something's completely different, it does not fit there. It cannot possibly be from that time. And that is some way that we can investigate further instead of believing. And so we can relatively tell with that stratigraphy which ones are older and how much time probably passed. For example, when something's buried, things tend to be buried, and that's because sediment is deposited over time. The layout of the earth does not stay the same. Slowly the wind picks up sand and sediment in general and deposits this somewhere. Time by time the coastline changes because the sea is eroding on it. Those things have a quite steady height if there are no catastrophic events that mess it up, which will leave its own mark of some different sediment suddenly appearing in great quantity. But usually it's quite a steady height. And by looking at that, by estimating how deep it is, we can know how old that thing is. That again is the art of stratigraphy. And that is how it mostly went at the level of a pretty good estimate. Well, we have a pretty good idea that this is from 5,000 years ago. And we could be almost entirely sure that was the best we had until last century. Because last century we had what is often called the chronometric revolution. Actually, writing is usually mentioned as the first chronometric revolution because people are literally writing the time down. But as we see, that can be a little tricky. You have to trust that the guy is telling the truth or not. But the second chronometric revolution was quite different. But to understand how the way we can tell the age of things has improved, we have to think about atoms. Probably have heard that word. You certainly have heard that word. Many are trying to call our current age the atomic age. And you probably know those are some small things that you can study and that you can even make it explode. And you are probably also familiar that the dangers of radioactivity, that those explosions leave behind this radioactive thing that is very bad for you. You're probably familiar with that. Now, what you have to learn, perhaps, is that those explosions are just accelerating a process of the atoms radiating energy. So the energy is coming from the atom, but the explosion is just making it go real fast. But things are also radioactive without exploding. They also release energy over time. Explosion just makes it go faster. And so the atom that radiates energy, it does so at some very predictable rate. We know when something is going to be less radioactive. It goes weakening over time. And so if we have a bunch of atoms that are radioactive, that are emitting energy at constant rate, then we can tell how much time has passed when you look again at those atoms, because they have decayed into another kind of atom. When they emit energy, they change from one atom to another. They emit part of themselves, they decay into another atom. If we have a jar full of atoms, we can just leave it there for 1,000, 2,000 years. And when we look back at it, we will know exactly how much time has passed because of that decay. No, not exactly, because we don't have the tools to actually peer on those subatomic particles responsible for that. We just have the weak force for now to average it out. But it's very close, it's very exact, that passage of time of atoms. Actually, our clocks nowadays, the second is defined by the atom. That is how precise the atom is. By how many times the electron does its thing around a certain atom. That is how we define time itself nowadays. The second at least. So, you should probably also know that everything that we see, that we touch, is made out of atoms. And so we have a real bunch of these things all around them. And that old Egyptian pottery was also made of atoms. You probably can see where this is going. Because if that pottery was made 5,000 years ago, then the atoms of that pottery have to have decayed by a certain amount. So when we take that pottery, when we break it open and analyze those impurities, when we analyze the gas pockets that were created inside of it, we see that the kind of atom present there matches exactly the decayed atom that you would expect. And so the pottery changes with time, it grows older, its atoms and composition change from that original mud that was used to build it. That is, we know, and that is why we know that Narmer was truly unifying Egypt by that time. And if Egypt was doing that at that time, we have even much older pottery, and humankind cannot have possibly been created at that date. There are even older civilizations, and they have left many kinds of remains that show that humans were alive and kicking before that supposed creation date that the Maya put on the calendar. And so, even if the Maya meant that the creation date was only for the Maya, not for the entire humankind, just they themselves, they would still be wrong, because on Mesoamerica, on the Maya region, we see civilizations that are also older than that. And that we can pretty much tell that writing cannot possibly be right. But how much older are those things? Did the Maya just miss by a little bit? Was that some mistake of 1 or 2 cycles? Well, we can double it. We can go to 10,000 years and we find the Clovis culture, the Clovis points that we find. So there is a city today called Clovis, and we find remains there of human civilization that are 10,000 years old and a little more. And we can double it again, 20,000 years. And by that time, the atoms that we find will testify for the human migration of those very Mayan ancestors from Asia into the Americas. The Mayas were not just created into the Americas, they did not just appear there at some time out of nowhere. But we can see that timeline, when no longer any human is found on the Maya, on the Mesoamerica, but they are found in North America. We can see they came from there, and they slowly spread through the continent. And so, of course, those of North America did not just appear out of nowhere either. You can see the bridge. It might have come from some other places too, but there was the Bering Bridge, and we see people on Asia before people on America. And you can see that older and older traces showing whence they came. And there is always that some other place or some other form all the way billions of years ago. So we can indeed, with all certainty, today affirm that the Maya were wrong. Not because we choose to believe in something else, but because we learned about the world and how precisely the atoms behave. So we are forced to accept that the Maya account disagrees with this reality we live in. The way the atoms behave show us the Maya could not possibly be right. And so, just as we are absolutely sure that the Maya tale of creation is nothing more than that myth of some worthless fantasy that some not so smart savage made up, we know too that the Hebrew mythology, which puts the creation and garden just a few centuries earlier than the Maya, is identically no more than another vile and deceitful fairy tale. Perhaps even a worse one, since we can see it was not very original. It was quite plagiarized from those Levantine myths around it. Instead of being as original piece of art as the Maya is. Now, for example, I'm certain that you are sure that the computing device, the computer or the smartphone or whatever you are using to watch this, was not created by gods, not by the Mayan gods, nor any other. It was some human that made it, or some mechanical production line that put those circuits together and made it. This is what the reality before us makes us affirm for certain, that this thing we have here was not made by God. This cappuccino I just drank was not made by God. I literally made it just a while ago. And nor was this cup. I made it. But we are seeing this. That's the reality before us. And you did not see the guy who made that cell phone or that thing you are holding and watching this. But you know it was not God. It was someone. Your experience with reality, your knowledge of how the world works, leads you, forces you to accept that conclusion. Some, actually most people, might say that God created man, who then created the device. That's probably what you might think of a religion. But we know that God did not create Alan Turing, for example, or some other man. That is not what people mean when they say that God created man, that created that thing. We know that Alan Turing and that guy who made your cell phone came from some mother, is the son of some mother. But we mean that just there, beyond our knowledge, that some first man was created by God. That is what it means. It's not about this current world. The purchase that just outside of what we should know. But God created water, for example. Most would readily say yes. But did God also create hydrogen and oxygen atoms? Because then the creation of water would be absolutely meaningless. By creating those atoms of water, water and ice and all the 10,000 things would not need creation. They would follow as a consequence. And if nothing else, we would have it to distinguish those water from God that He created by Himself from that which is created and destroyed right before our eyes, as we do electrolysis on water, separating those building pieces into atoms, and just as we burn that hydrogen back into water. So if God made some water, then it should be almost all gone by now, broken down into atoms, and new water formed in its place. As we study, we see the conditions of the past planet that require that. We see that water is not really some permanent act of creation. It's made of something, and that something often makes more, and it's often broken apart back into its piece. And likewise, we see that no animal appeared to be created from nowhere. It just appeared there. But that from some place or some form they came. Just as we are absolutely sure that the hand of God did not connect that circuitry of that device, so too we watch this history of the world to know that He did not create humankind or any other animal. It is that undeniable reality before our eyes that forces us to admit that, not because we believe on something else, but because that's the reality we live in. That reality tells us that the Maya God is wrong, and every other. Of course, we can say that God created the atoms then, and that the atoms made the water and made humankind. There was some big plan. We can just push that just outside our current field of knowledge, think that our beliefs will be safe. But that already destroys every classical religion and myth of creation. since those current religions rely on that creation of humankind, which we can be sure, just as the Maya, that cannot possibly be the case. But if we say that God creates the atoms, then what is there? We cannot now know, can we? Well, the time we learn more, we have to push it back further. After we learn more about the atoms, we see that they are not that thing that was just created, that they come from some subatomic particle, and that we will have to say now that God created those instead. And we will also be pushing back further and further, because the more we learn, the less place for a miracle there is less space to put that mystical power that makes something. Instead, it becomes a burden. We have to explain the world and also how that God that was made up fits with that. It's not only an unnecessary addition, but it disagrees with reality. But of course, some people can also always make up more excuses and push it back further and further, trying to justify the thing they want to believe in. They can say that those writings of the Maya, or perhaps those Reverie Garden of Eden fairy tales, were just some allegory of some place beyond time and beyond our grasp, trying to put it on that creation myth beyond our ability to prove it wrong, just outside the reach of all logic, so they can choose the complacence of ignoring reality and all its problems by the willful blindness of choosing what to believe. That's what most people does. But as I briefly mentioned right at the beginning, there is no need for that brute force to disprove the Mayan religion and such in order to reject the ideas. Because simply, there is no reason to admit those suppositions of the Mayan gods that someone just made up in the first place. No proof is required to promptly reject those lines of thought. But rather, we have to reject anything that is unnecessary and unjustifiable. And so we have to dismiss those Mayan fairy tales and the Middle Western ones long before any counter-proof, since those baseless claims have no proof in themselves and are equally rejected with no need for a counter-proof. And all such inventions that have no root in the necessities of reality are a hindrance to a further understanding of the world and the pursuit of actual truth. Now this line here, simply because if all ideas were equally valid, then all science and art would cease to exist, since none could be more right or wrong than any other. The discrepancy of those ideas with the unwavering reality before us is the judge of how correct, how real they are, so that we do not choose in what to believe, picking that which is most convenient to our preconceived notions, but rather than having an answer for things, we are simply forced to admit one thing over another. This very cool line that I just read here, about being forced to admit one thing over another and nothing else, nothing extraneous. My light is getting weak, it's no longer shining on my face. Well, it's almost over. So, this cool line that I just read is from a book. It's my book. It's available both on Amazon and free online. The name is On the Origin of the Subatomic Species. And I mentioned that an even shorter description of this Maya situation, where we are sure that they are wrong. But also it goes beyond in showing that we could reject those ideas even before we are sure, even before we had proven them wrong, simply because there was no reason to accept them in the first places. My book discusses that. It deals with the validity of some scientific assertion, What are we forced to admit, and what is purely extraneous baggage to be trimmed off? That's the topic of my book, and there I apply it to modern sciences. Because the current models that we have in science are not doing so good on that department either. And so, if you like that thought, if you are interested in the book, I will leave the link in the description. And as for the script of this little video, here it is. About my religion, the calendar, and how we have means to tell now if that was what really happened. We have this history, you can see. And then we can ask, is that a valid assertion or not? What does reality say? Can we really choose in what to believe? Can we deny reality and just believe whatever? So if you are interested, I will leave the script and the link to my book in the description of this video. See ya, and thanks for watching.